Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. As is customary, we'll give everybody a couple of minutes just to join us. See, we've got 22 people joining us, and that's quickly gone up to 38. So it's a really interesting day today with the end of the furlough programme, and actually we're seeing a lot of interest in employment and what's going to happen to people as the economy recovers today. So it's a really great day to be talking about this subject. And we're up to 42 people, so I'll give it another couple of minutes and then we'll move forward. We seem to be settling, so we'll start. So as I said, good morning and welcome to the conversation today. My name is Kim Chaplin. I'm the Associate Director at the Centre for Ageing Better, responsible for the work agenda. Well, not responsible, I advise on the work agenda, very big agenda indeed. Now at the Centre for Ageing Better, we are a What Works organisation funded by a lottery endowment, and our vision is that people have better later lives. And one of the key areas for intervention in securing a better later life is work. And as we all know, I think our lives are getting longer. And what we're really interested in is that actually our working lives are not necessarily keeping pace with the length of our life expectation, and they need to. And so we have been working in the area of employment and looking to intervene in that area to make employment, or to try and change employment, to make it more age friendly. And a key area of intervention is recruitment. And that's the area that we're going to talk about today. Recruitment is really an interesting topic. I'm not going to steal anybody's thunder at this point, but I think we will reflect on why it's interesting when we get to the end of the conversation. So to sort of stimulate that conversation, we've got three slots. First, Beth Mason from the Institute of Employment Studies is going to talk to us about the current and future landscape for elder workers. And then Johnny Rudge from the National Institute of Economic Research is going to talk about elder workers' experience in that environment. And then finally, from the Behavioural Insight team, Georgia Bremner is going to talk about the language of job advertisement. So that takes us through a really nice story. Then I'll do a little summary for you, and we'll open that up to questions. While the presentations are going on, if you could use the chat, I think we're all used to this now, aren't we? If you could use the chat to record any questions or insights or observations that you've got, we'll summarise those and put them to the panel at the end of the conversation. So I think we're all used to that format now. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Beth to kick us off on that first presentation.
Great, thank you, Kim, and hello to everyone. So I'll just share my screen and I'll get started. Great, so hopefully you can all see that. So as Kim said, so I'm Beth Mason, I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Employment Studies, and our research was looking at the current and future recruitment landscape. So our research interviewed employers about their current recruitment practices and their sort of future recruitment practices, and specifically their approaches to addressing diversity and inclusion, particularly with a focus on age, obviously. The methods we used was a rapid evidence assessment of the grey and academic literature, and we did some secondary data analysis of existing surveys of HR and recruitment professionals, and we did interviews with recruitment and inclusion and diversity and HR professionals from a range of different industries. I think it's worth mentioning the context that we did this research in, as it did have an impact on our findings. So obviously we did it within the COVID-19 context, and that meant that there'd been a shift in recruitment practices amongst employers as people adapted to new, more virtual ways of working. We also did the research when the Black Lives Matter movement was at the forefront of media attention last summer, and that shaped a lot of our interview findings, particularly around there was a greater focus on racial and ethnic diversity in the workplace, and that was discussed by a lot of our interviewees. So firstly, thinking about the current recruitment processes that people were using. So we divided this into three stages: the pre-interview, interview and post-interview stage. So within the pre-interview stage, it commonly started with an annual planning process, so assessing the need and the budget for upcoming year. And in absence of planning, recruitment was tended to sort of begin with a hiring manager identifying a need within the team. Sometimes there was a business case or an approval process that people had to go through. And we identified that the lack of this kind of planning process could have implications for diversity, in that employers would be more likely to resort to just similar methods that they'd used before, or quick or reactive methods. Then there was the job description advertising element. This quite commonly included some sort of analysis process to define the role in terms of knowledge, behaviours, skills, experience that was required. Although some employers were considering kind of candidate capability, or their potential over their experiences, in the hope that this would increase the potential pool of candidates. There was some language and content of job descriptions considered by employers, particularly in relation to gender, and there were some people who were using online tools to decode language. In terms of the actual advertising, the most common channels that people used were still websites, their own website, job boards such as Indeed, and social media, particularly LinkedIn. There was a sort of a candidate attraction and employer brand element to the process, which was to help draw talent to the organisation. Again, this was tended to be done between social and professional networks and their own website in order to grow a brand. And then the application and shortlisting stage, which typically used a CV, sometimes also a cover letter. Some organisations described having HR do an initial sift of CVs or conducting a telephone interview to assess fit of a candidate. And this aspect of fit came up quite a lot, and it was assessed in various ways. So some people had very structured frameworks of behaviours and competencies that they were looking for within a candidate, but other people used a less structured approach of just assessing sort of a general feel of whether the candidate would fit within the organisation. Then on to the interview stage. So some people were just using a single interview, but actually it was quite common for people to have 2 or 3 stages of interviews. These were mostly done face-to-face, particularly before the pandemic, but with an increase in telephone interviews. And obviously during the pandemic, everyone had gone to sort of video-based interviews. The interviews tended to be based on either a defined set of competencies, or they followed the candidate's CV or application form. There was also quite often an element of skills testing, so an in-tray exercise, a skills test, a psychometric test, and these would present candidates with work-based scenarios to test job-related skills. Assessment centres and group interviews were not as common by the people we interviewed. Actually, they felt that they were quite impersonal and they were kind of moving away from them. And then in the post-interview stage, we found that work trials and temporary contracts were used by some employers, particularly within manufacturing and hospitality. Some of these were short, unpaid trials used to assess the skills or the fit of the person within a team. In terms of, making a selection and an offer, employers would collect feedback and scores from each stage of the process. Some were using very strict scoring mechanisms, while others used a more informal approach. Sometimes a final decision was made by just the hiring manager without HR input. This was particularly in the public sector. And senior management often had a role in the selection of senior positions. So generally, we found that the activities people were using were comparable across all organisations. They typically had a job description, they had a process for advertising and shortlisting, there was multiple interviews and some element of skills testing, although the way that these were implemented did vary, obviously. We found that actually it was the sector and the size of the organisation that had more impact on the process than the industry. So we found that large and public sector organisations tended to have more strategies in place, used more centralised processes, and had more tools and guidance to draw on. And this led them to have a more structured recruitment process, which involved practices that aimed to improve our diversity, most commonly in terms of gender, ethnicity, and disability. So then thinking about the future recruitment process, we found these 4 common areas of focus. So starting off with a great emphasis on employer branding. This is done to attract more diverse candidates, to also build a talent pool so that they could that they can draw on in the future, and also to engage passive job seekers. There was an emphasis on providing a more positive candidate experience. That's to improve perceptions of the employer for both successful and unsuccessful candidates. And this is done by typically improving the communications with candidates, the availability of information, and using technology that creates a more positive and memorable experience, such as different types of assessment tools and application methods. There was seen to be a greater use of technology and analytics in the future. So things like AI, semantic search, data science, chatbots, those sort of things. They were thought to be used to assess skill gaps and workforce planning, to source candidates, to do sort of communication and admin tasks, assessment and selection analytics, and also evaluating the recruitment channels that people were using. However, we did find that recruiters were cautious about implementing these kind of technologies, and there was definitely a gap between them perceiving them as important, but actually intending to use them was lower. And that was mainly based on a lack of trust in technology's ability to carry out these tasks over an actual person, and a consciousness of the kind of biases and errors that can come into play when you use technology. And then lastly, we found that there were changes in the future workforce needs. So employers were thinking about the future in terms of what skills they're going to need. They were considering new technologies that were going to be implemented and how that was going to impact their workforce. There was a greater focus on candidates' ability to learn. So like I said earlier, having an adaptable workforce. And also a more flexible workforce. So considering whether they should have a larger non-permanent workforce who were able to adapt to change, or recruiting for project-specific talent. Although there was recognition that these kind of contracts do have risks for sort of the quality of work that people are doing. And there was also a reflection on the increased flexibility that's happened as a result of the pandemic and how that will carry forward in the future. So thinking about age within the recruitment and the perceptions of age from the people that we spoke to. So in general, age was not seen as a priority diversity issue. Most employers believed that they already had a diverse workforce in relation to age, and therefore they didn't think age was a problem that they needed to take action on. On the whole, employers didn't analyse age data of their workforce of candidates. A small number did, and they used that data to justify some decision making, but others suggested that they could just tell that their organisation was age diverse by simply looking around the organisation. It was gender and ethnicity that were the most common areas of diversity that employers felt needed immediate action. These were more commonly measured and analysed, whereas most employers didn't use any age-specific friendly practices to support the recruitment of older workers. Of the small number of employers who did consider age, it was actually a lack of younger workers that they believed was more problematic in terms of recruitment. And some employers suggested that there would have to be a specific problem, such as an age discrimination claim, for them to be motivated to act on the age agenda. So from analysing the recruitment practices described in our research, we identified some key gaps in the recruitment process which may be hindering inclusivity. So thinking first specifically about age, we found that there was a lack of strategies targeting age diversity, or that age was excluded as a core element of diversity strategies that were in place. There was use of job descriptions that aren't assessed for ageist language, or they included criteria that excludes older workers, such as particular qualifications or experience. There was presence of age-related stereotypes and negative perceptions, such as older workers being less presentable, less physically fit, or having poorer IT skills compared to younger workers. And there was just a general poor use of age data, with assumptions being made about the extent to which age diversity was an issue within an organisation without actually analysing workforce or recruitment data. And then thinking more widely about other areas of inclusivity, like I've already mentioned, there's an emphasis on this cultural fit, which typically uses subjective or unstructured methods that are liable to bias, including age. There is evidence of use of unstructured interviews where interviewers don't use the same questions for all candidates, or maybe only one interviewer is present. And this can result in candidates being assessed on different criteria and individual bias having an impact. Also, the use of subjective feedback, so collecting informal feedback from a wider team or other sort of non-standardized approaches for evaluating a candidate's performance, which increase the likelihood of bias having an impact. And a reliance on individual decision makers, so where one person has a final say on a recruitment decision without much consideration given to the potential attitudes and bias held by that person. So then just finally, well, most employers didn't report using any age-specific recruitment practices. The literature search that we did provide some evidence of some effective practices that could be used. So using a range of advertising methods to target older workers, such as using imagery of older workers on advertising, and using a range of advertising channels that are maybe more relevant to older workers, that would increase the likelihood of having an age-diverse long list. Using application methods that reduce the likelihood of capturing explicit and implicit age cues, such as removing age or date of birth from CVs and using application forms that ask just job relevant questions. And considering the attitudes and overall influence of the decision maker or decision makers, and ensuring that they don't hold ageist attitudes. So either using multiple decision makers to reduce the undue influence of individuals, or taking a sort of wider organisational approach to create an inclusive culture that challenges negative attitudes and really celebrates the contributions of workers of all ages. So I'm going to stop there. So that was a very quick summary of all our main findings. And I'm going to hand over to Johnny, who's going to speak a bit about the older workers' experience of recruitment.
Okay, thanks, Beth. I'll just share my screen as well. Okay, hopefully you can see it there. Shout if you can't. So yeah, the second part of this research program was looking at older workers themselves and how they experience the recruitment process. So we looked at things like whether they experience any age-related barriers and challenges in the recruitment process, and to what extent they feel age influences the process, the behavior and the decisions made by them and the employers. So we did 55 interviews with people aged 50 and over who were at a time in work or furloughed from their current work. And they were recruited by a recruitment company and paid incentives to include a mix of different people with different characteristics, including within our age category and by gender, location, sector, ethnicity, education, and so on. And then we also did a nationally representative survey of 1,000 adults, and then with like an additional booster of people aged 50 and over. So what do we find? One of our kind of like overarching findings is that people in their 50s and 60s really do feel that they are disadvantaged due to their age. In our survey, more than a third said they felt they would be at a disadvantage when they applied for jobs and because of their age. And in the interviews, there was this general thinking that, once you turn 50 was often mentioned as this kind of magic number. Then you kind of enter a kind of danger area where you might start facing age discrimination, and where it might get harder and harder to find a suitable job. And in the survey, we also had 15% who said they had experienced age discrimination directly, and in other questions, 18% said they had been told they were too old, and 16% said they had been told by employers they were looking for younger candidates. But mostly what we heard in the interviews was this feeling that age discrimination was kind of operating kind of beneath the surface. People were sure it existed, but they recognized that they often didn't really have a definitive proof of it. It was kind of their suspicions, feelings, and of different things that happened directly or indirectly during the recruitment process. So we go into quite a bit of detail on this in the report. Just one example is people cited their own experiences in the workplace, seeing, working day to day, seeing how internal recruitment and promotion rounds happen in their workplace, and also when they're a part of selection panels themselves, seeing their bosses or colleagues or themselves, how they might suffer from these kind of unconscious biases and so on when they assess candidates. So we had people who also recognized, that they themselves had done it when they were younger. So this person said, I used to do it. I've got to be honest. I didn't employ a bloke once because he had a beard and I thought he looked a bit old. I'm guilty of it, and people are now doing it to me. So just at this point, it's probably quite useful to confirm that there is plenty of research that shows that they are in fact right. It's not just suspicions kind of grabbed out of thin air. I think some of the strongest evidence are countless studies that send out identical CVs to thousands of employers, and then kind of like tweak the age of these CVs, and then they find that older candidates are less likely to be invited for interviews. So people, we obviously tried to explore whether there was certain areas or stages of the recruitment process where this was more of a problem than others for older workers. But we find that, age disadvantage and age bias, the perception of older workers is really, this is happening throughout the whole application stage, to kind of deciding to apply all the way to the kind of final outcome and feedback. So we don't find there's kind of a place where you need to like focus the effort. You need to focus the effort like kind of throughout the recruitment stage, and different people kind of experience different stages differently. So the application stage, just to give a flavor of some of our findings, quite often it's seen as impersonal, frustrating. People receive these template-made rejections and feel they hit their head against a brick wall. Often people spoke about this, observing that they had a declining success rate as they got older. So this quote was very typical. I have the skills they're looking for. I have the experience they're looking for. I think I can articulate myself well. So age is the only thing, and I may be jumping to conclusions I don't know. So people quite often spoke about these jobs that fitted them perfectly, where they felt they at least should get to the interview stage. And obviously very often recognized, it might be because of a tightening labor market, it might be other factors, but just quite often, based on other pieces of evidence as well, have a feeling that it might be age related. And this uncertainty was also kind of quite damaging for people, because they didn't know whether it was themselves or the age, and that kind of damaged confidence as well. So people often spoke about, the frustration about not having a chance to attend interviews and disprove the age-related stereotypes, which was harder to do during the application stage. People did speak a lot about different mitigation strategies, including concealing age from CVs and kind of dumbing down their CVs by shortening their employment histories to kind of hide their age in that kind of like indirect way, or hide important experiences that would deem them to be too experienced. But they recognized that such strategies also had a downside, because they might, by doing that, hide an experience which would have been very beneficial and might have gotten them the job or the interview. And people also spoke about that, by doing that, you are kind of only just delaying the inevitable, because the age would sooner or later kind of appear, at least during the interview stage, and then the disadvantage might turn up in the interview stage. The interview stage was probably described as the most, the one where people had most direct kind of experiences of age discrimination or age disadvantage. And just some examples from the report, people quite often felt on the back foot when they kind of like walked through the office and saw that there were a lot of younger employees, and they would be like by far the oldest in the room. And then subsequently they were interviewed by a very young selection panel. And that kind of threw a lot of candidates off kind of straight away. And the second person here says it maybe feels slightly inferior. It makes you question yourself. Should I be sat here? Should I be applying for jobs? It makes you think, should I just stick at what I've got now? I'm at this age. It doesn't fill you with loads of confidence. It was also at the interview stage where people had these kind of like fairly direct examples of, for instance, questions related to potential age-related stereotypes, such as like kind of in-depth questions about, are you really up to these physical tasks in the job? What's your plans for retirement? Kind of indicating you might not have very many years left to be in this job, lack of ambitions, and so on. And those stereotypes, we in the report we describe at length how interview participants really spoke a lot about these stereotypes. Sometimes they came up directly in the recruitment process, sometimes indirectly, but the older applicants felt it was kind of part of parcel of the recruitment process and kind of like apparent all the way through. And one to highlight is that the third bullet point here, that people, 29% of people in the survey said they had been told they were too experienced, and people in the interviews said that, when they were told that, it was very hard not to interpret that as code for you're too old. And some of these stereotypes, as you can see here, people spoke about, the kind of like concern that they might get exacerbated by the pandemic, especially things like the reduced physical capacity and vulnerability and so on. So this all had an incredible impact, negative impact on well-being. A lot of interview participants spoke about the recruitment process being the first place where they thought of themselves as old. In other areas of their life, they were not even close to considering themselves old, but then in the recruitment process, that was where they started kind of recognizing that their age was increasing. They described that as frustrating, soul-destroying, a blow to the confidence, and kind of like this, that your own sense of worth to society, your contribution, you suddenly start thinking about these things. It also impacted people's decisions. So a quarter of people in the survey over 50 said they had wanted to move jobs, but felt unable to do so because of their age. So that was very typical in the interviews to speak about, oh, better the devil you know. So people spoke about, I'm in this job. It's not the perfect job. Really, I would like to start applying for other jobs and see if I can find something better. But I'm really, as this guy is saying, I'm really afraid of jumping and finding the grass isn't greener, and then either being stuck somewhere, unable to come back, or nothing to go on to. So that was something people already kind of from their early 50s were starting to think about. Ooh, maybe this is my last chance to move jobs, because when I'm getting to 54, 55, 56, 57, then this will be very difficult and very risky as well. It also changed the decisions in terms of what jobs to apply for. So people spoke about becoming increasingly selective over time, carefully choosing which jobs to apply for, which organizations to apply for, and in order not to waste time, both theirs and recruiters. Some did speak about looking at job adverts for indications whether they were looking for a younger person or had biases against older people. I think you'll hear much more about that in the next presentation. And the final thing was that a vast majority of older people in the survey, 50s and 60s, people in their 50s and 60s, always disclosed their age on their CV, 95%. A lot of people in the interview said, I just didn't realize this was an opportunity. I just always put my age on. It's there in applications form anyway, and so on. But there were also quite a few who said, actually, I want to be upfront and honest. about my age, about my profile, precisely because it reduces my chance to get an interview. So there were a few people who said they would rather not waste their time, and they would rather avoid a painful experience during the interview where they might be discriminated against due to age. So they kind of like gave the employers the opportunity to reject them at this stage, so they didn't have to waste their time. Okay, so there's much more in the report, but just a few recommendations, and obviously this project as a whole is kind of like the first stage of Centre for Aging Better's work, and they will inform kind of like how to design and test new recruitment processes to reduce this age bias. But just some quick recommendations from this is that carefully considering the framing and wording of job advertisements, and also on the kind of like recruitment websites, how that comes across. Consider adjusting or removing monitoring and inclusion sections on application forms. A lot of older applicants spoke about, why do I have to put all this personal detail about myself? Maybe they're using it, especially when they got like rejections or like maybe automated rejections within an hour. Was that like an algorithm that kind of looked at these characteristics? Obviously, loads of people knew that they were used for monitoring, but they were still a little bit suspicious. Then also within the application process, consider whether certain things like having a standardized, provide your full employment history, that might disadvantage older people who have a lot of employment experience and qualifications, and that might take a long time if they cannot tailor it. And then make more job seekers aware that it's not required to put age on CVs. Ensure the interview panels are as diverse and inclusive as possible. And the big one, I guess, is avoid making assumptions about older workers based on stereotypes. Obviously, Beth said that there were these negative perceptions and stereotypes among employers, and even when they're not recognized, it's probably the hardest one to change, because quite a lot of the time it is these unconscious biases at play. And then the last one, improve the system of feedback to unsuccessful applicants. This was quite a big part of the kind of void that people felt they were in, where they consistently got rejected for jobs, and they thought they were suitable for these jobs, but they never got any meaningful feedback or any feedback at all. And that kind of left them in this void where they were like, maybe this is due to my age. Okay, that's it for me. I'll stop sharing and hand over to Georgie.
Thank you, Johnny. That was very interesting. So let me just share my screen now. Hope you can see that. Okay, share. Okie dokes. So yes, thanks, Johnny. That was very interesting. That does take us nicely onto the project that I was part of, which was testing the effect of ageist language in job adverts. And yeah, sorry, my name's Georgie. I'm a senior advisor at the Behavioural Insights team, and we are a social purpose organisation that uses insights from behavioural economics and social psychology and apply these to kind of real world problems, policy, service design, processes and organisations, with the aim of improving the effectiveness of those processes and helping people make better choices for themselves and society as well. So what was our research question? So we were specifically testing what words, phrases and images used in job adverts may attract or dissuade older job seekers from applying to a job. And we had 3 different components to this project. The first was a literature review, which really was to understand what theoretically can we say about words and phrases that could attract or dissuade older job seekers from applying to a job. So these are really understanding what are the age-related stereotypes out there related to younger and older job seekers. And then we kind of produced this short list of the most important words and phrases to test. And we did this in an online experiment where we had 5,000 participants viewing mock job adverts. and actually getting them to rate how likely they would be to apply, or what their perceptions were of how well they would fit in the organisation, or how likely they think they were to maybe get the job. And then any words or phrases that were found to be problematic, we then analysed 11 million real-world job adverts to understand how prevalent these problematic words and phrases actually are in the real world. So what aspects of job adverts may attract or deter older workers from applying? So the first category is stereotypes related to older age. So because job adverts by their nature will have positive attributes, they're not going to ask for someone with negative attributes. So that's why we're sort of focusing on positive words here. But there are a number of positive words related to older age, such as dependable, patient, dedicated, knowledgeable, that we hypothesise could, if they were present in a job advert, have a positive effect on older job seekers. And then the other category are stereotypes relating to younger age. So in the literature, these are words such as energetic, innovative, fun, enthusiastic, ambitious, adaptable. And we hypothesize that these might have a negative impact on older job seekers, not because they don't think they have those qualities, but because it might signal that the advert was looking for someone younger, because these are stereotypes of a younger person. The third category that we came across were kind of implicit references to younger job seekers, or people being at an earlier stage in their career. So jobs that asked for recent graduates, or being specific about how many years experience they wanted. And 3 to 5 years was a really commonly asked for length of time. And that might signal someone who's younger perhaps. And then this term technologically savvy came up as well in the literature as being kind of a signal of a younger person, potentially because they're more likely to have grown up kind of digitally native, as they say. And then the fourth category were inclusive benefits and policy. So we knew from the literature that there were a number of employer benefits that people get offered, so training and development opportunities for all career stages, flexible working opportunities, and also generous pension contributions. These are benefits that are valued particularly by older workers. And so we thought that if these were present in a job advert, they would be likely to encourage a job seeker to apply. And then finally, another concept we came across in the literature was diversity and equal opportunity statements. And we wanted to test a kind of short and to the point one, but also a more lengthy one that kind of explicitly mentions that they're encouraging people of different ages as well as other characteristics to apply. So we focus in on these 5 different categories of words and phrases to test. And this really was based on the hypothesis that we think these would have an impact because they are stereotypical enough that these actually exist in real world job adverts. So you'll notice that we originally set out to look at images as well, but we decided that we weren't actually are not present in job adverts really at all. You rarely images of actual employees. That's more for company websites. And we were theoretically interested in understanding the impact of inclusive policies or diversity statements, because the literature is very mixed about these things. There's very little experimental research actually testing the impact on job seekers. So we tested this on 5,000 different participants. 3,500 were older participants, so 45 to 74, and then 1,500 were 18 to 35. And the reason why we included the younger cohort was really more as a test to see if anything we found was positive for older people, just checking it wasn't negative for the younger people. So here's an example of the mock job advert that we used in this kind of online simulated environment. And we gave people a little bit of information about the role. So this work is similar to the type of work you're looking for, but not exactly what you're looking for. The salary is slightly below your expectations. You meet the essential qualifications for the role, but none of the desirable criteria. And the reason for this setup is because we wanted the advert to be generally appealing, but not so appealing that it just didn't really matter what language was used in the actual job advert itself. So we were trying to kind of strike that balance. And you can see that there's these green fields in the job advert that were essentially these kind of blank fields that each person had a randomly generated version of the advert, which could include any combination of those words I showed you on the previous slide. So it could be that you're looking for someone, one person sees a recent graduate, another participant would have seen, we're looking for someone with 3 to 5 years experience. And same with these age stereotype fields, they were any combination of older age or younger age stereotypes that were inserted into those. With this inclusive benefit field, we randomly inserted any one of those 3 different inclusive benefits about generous contributions to the pension, flexible working opportunities, training development opportunities. And then there was a diversity statement, which was either the longer, shorter version or wasn't present at all. And what this enabled us to do was to understand what impact each individual word or phrase actually has on a job seeker's likelihood of applying. So each participant saw that job advert, and then they were asked a series of questions afterwards. So they were asked, how likely would you be to apply for this job? And they were also asked questions around their perceptions of success. So how likely do you think you'd be to get an interview? How likely do you think you'd be to get the job? And then also questions about organizational fit. So how likely do you think it is that you'll fit, but also how do you think the organization would think that you fit? So kind of getting at both those angles there. And then the main outcome from the study is this slightly complicated graph in a way, but really each of these rows is the average effect size that each of these words had on the participants' likelihood to apply. So you've got the list of words and phrases we tested, and what you'll see here is these are having a positive impact on the likelihood of someone saying that they would apply, and these are having a more negative impact down here. So what we found would have a positive impact were inclusive benefits, so generous pension contributions, flexible working opportunities, and development opportunities, and even that short diversity statement had a slightly positive effect at a slightly lower significance level. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we found that those implicit references to youth, so words such as technologically savvy, saying 3 to 5 years work experience, or worst of all, explicitly saying a recent graduate, was seen to be the most having the strongest impact on reducing the likelihood of applying. So these were broadly in line with our hypotheses. I think counter to our predictions, however, is that a lot of these age stereotyped words in the middle, whether they are stereotypically about young people, so fun, energetic, or stereotypically about older people, so dedicated, patient, for instance, they really didn't have much an effect on the likelihood of applying. And similarly with our secondary outcome measures, where we were looking at, how likely do you think it would be to get an interview, or how good a fit do you think you would be in this organization? It was the same sort of thing. The real sort of words that were unhelpful here were these references to younger people, which you could imagine. So recent graduate is obviously a big no-no in terms of people thinking they'd be likely to get an interview, and using terminology like innovative, technologically savvy is equally off-putting as well. And we see the same with thinking you fit in the culture or not. And interestingly, the short diversity statement that was, to the point, saying that they welcome people from all different backgrounds, that did have a positive impact on people's perception that they would fit into the organisation. The final task that we got people to do was just actually explicitly highlight on the screen any words that they found particularly attractive, or any words or phrases they found particularly off-putting. And this gave us some kind of additional insights. So what each line is here is the percentage of participants that rated the word as attractive, so that's in green, and the percentage of participants that rated the word as sort of unattractive or off-putting over here. And what you'll see is similar to what we found previously, is all the inclusive benefits, so flexible working opportunities, generous pension contributions, training opportunities, and even our kind of filler one about paid annual leave. These were all very positively highlighted, with few people for some reason highlighting them as negative, but very much mostly very positive. Here, the young age stereotypes, you see this, they're sort of both off-putting to some. There's a sort of bulge in this red, meaning that, you know, more people are rating them as off-putting, but a lot of people rating them as attractive and appealing. So it's a mixed finding, really. There's not a clear-cut answer as to whether young age stereotypes are off-putting or appealing, because it seems like different people have different feelings about it. But the young age references that were highly off-putting were technologically savvy. You can see there's a kind of big bulge in red here. Recent graduate had the biggest red bulge, showing that most people were finding that very off-putting. And similarly saying that you wanted someone with 3 to 5 years experience. So kind of putting that upper end on experience, perhaps suggesting that you're after someone of a particular age. So what does this tell us, and what are our recommendations from this? So there are more recommendations in the report, but I think the key ones really are to, wherever possible in job adverts, focus on specific behaviours and skills rather than personality traits. So rather than saying you want someone who's technologically savvy, rather ask for programming skills, you know, be specific. Emphasize employer benefits, because these do seem to be appealing to older workers, and actually for younger cohorts as well, these are also appealing, and they're certainly not off-putting. And interestingly, we found that when we looked at the 11 million job adverts rarely mentioned these kinds of benefits. They rarely mentioned pension contributions or flexible working opportunities. I think never more than 6% of job adverts mentioned these. So it's a real missed opportunity for employers to make their roles more attractive to a broader range of people. And at least in this experiment, we found that the diversity statement does seem to have a positive impact, in that it encourages old job seekers to apply, or at least to feel like they would fit in. And it doesn't seem to be off-putting to younger job seekers either. So we would recommend that based on this evidence here. So that is all from me, and I'll pass back to Kim.
Thank you. So my job now is to sum up the presentations, but what I've also been doing is highlighting, well, looking at the chat. And so what I would like to do is just reflecting on the chat, just step back a little bit from the presentations and talk a bit about today and furlough, because there's been a lot going on around that, and the labour market in general, and then come back to the Good Recruitment for Older Workers project, which is a demand side project that sits in that context. So what I would do is point people on the chat to 2 studies that I think are really fundamental to policy in this space. And the first one was published on the 16th of December by OECD, and that provides really good evidence about the productivity of multi-generational workforces. And I've been looking for that for some time. I've worked in DWP and other employment and skills areas for over 40 years now, and I agree with, I think somebody on the chat was saying, this issue with older workers is prevalent and has been going on for quite a long time. And actually, people recognise the issue but have not got underneath the issue to find out actually what the challenges are and to start to develop policy to address that. It's sort of been an accepted thing that employment programmes and initiatives perform less well for the 50+ group, and we can't tolerate that. But the business case for that has always been flaky because nobody has done the investigation. So I would point you to that study by OECD. It's really, really good. The other thing I would point you to is a study that's been published today by the Institute of Financial Studies, IFS, and that has a title I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's how workers have fared through COVID. Really, really, really good study. We'll share a pack, I think, at the end of it. And that study is looking at redundancy, if you like, now. So what has happened up to now in the furlough and in the lockdown policies, and how have people fared? And it compares the redundancy rate to the previous year. So it looks at redundancy from April 2020 to now. And that is really interesting. And the headline findings, I only read it yesterday, so I can't go into detail, are fascinating, because there is definitely a geographic impact in terms of people that have been made redundant and their return rate to the labour market. So it looks at people that return within 6 months, and there's an age factor as well. And the headline conclusion appears to be that actually we focused on youth, and there's a hell of a pipeline of jobs. We will do the chat piece. There's a hell of a pipeline of jobs now through Kickstart for youth, and perhaps now is the time to think about initiatives for the older workers, because older workers are at risk of being locked out in all of this. And I'm not going to say any more about that background at the moment, other than to say that we are at a pivot point in the labour market and where it is. And unless we see more proactive interventions, both on the supply side and the demand side, there is a significant chance that more people than ever will be locked out of the labour market in the 50+ group. And the 50+ group is significantly more likely to turn into a long-term unemployed group than other age groups. There's loads of data on that. Now, what we're talking about today is a supply side initiative, sorry, demand side initiative. So we know that, and I detect that most people that are on this call are working with supply side and programs. And I found in the last 18 months that people are acutely aware that they need to think differently about the 50+ group, and they need to think differently about programs, and that generic programs don't work. It is no good just thinking about the program side and the supply side without actually having a different intervention on the demand side as well. And really what we're here to talk about today in terms of the good recruitment for older workers is how we start to try and influence that demand side to do things differently. Because the lessons we've learned through this first phase of the Good Recruitment for Older Workers programme is that actually there's very, despite the clear evidence that multi-generational workforce actually gives a bottom line benefit to employers, that is not held as an understanding in the wider employer community. We conducted a study with YouGov just to test employers' attitudes as they come out of COVID. And what we found was that there was a very clear amount of support for the D&I protected characteristics, but most employers thought they were doing okay and actually don't plan to do anything different in the next 2 years. And time is actually the biggest barrier to them wanting to do anything differently. But we know that the fact of life is that the older workforce is going to be your workforce. And actually that is going to become significantly more the case as time moves on. And a 50-year-old actually has the opportunity of 20 years more working life. And yet we haven't established that. We were moving towards that prior to COVID, but we haven't established that as a common understanding. So we do see these prejudices in the employer world about older workers being more expensive and being less of an investment than younger workers. So this priority of looking at the bottom end of the entry level of the labour market, I should say, as being the priority because you're investing for the future. So there's some real cultural things that we need to do. The fact that a third of this group of workers that are really important, the older workers, feel prejudice actually in the recruitment process, right the way through the process, is a huge issue. And so we have been reflecting very hard about, well, what should we do next? What are the lessons we at the Centre for Ageing have learned? And we're delighted to be working with CIPD and REC to publish a guide today, which is employer facing, which is the first thing that we need to do is put some educational product out there to try and influence and get employers to pick up. The danger is though, or the risk in that is that actually employers fall into different groups. And if we're not careful, what will happen? Well, it doesn't matter if we're careful, we should be careful, but actually the good will get better. What we need is for all employers to take a step forward. So we've been thinking about actually what our next phase will be in all of this. We have got a phase 2 of this project and the phase 2 of the project, known as Grow 2, is to start working with employers to embed these lessons that we have learned, to learn about how it works for you. That piece is in a tender process. I'm not quite sure where it is, but we will be doing more on the ground with employers, and we're really keen to engage with employers across sectors and across size to look at their recruitment practices. We're also considering, as an organisation, what we can do to help on employer engagement, full stop, because this is really, really important in terms of representation. So I think that this is a really interesting study. This is a really interesting project that has a number of phases, and we're at the beginning of a phase. We have now got this toolkit that we're publishing today, which builds on the lessons we've learned. But actually, we've got now to do some really interesting work with employers around embedding what we've learned and reflecting how this works for them. And there's all sorts of educational pieces around this that we need to work together and collaboratively to influence the front end. And what I mean by the front end is that point where the supply side and the demand side meets. And what I think is interesting for us is how we can look at projects that we've got now that focus on employment support and the significant number of older workers that are likely to be unemployed in the coming months, and to put resource on influencing the labour market that surrounds them to embed the practices that are coming out of this study. And so in summary, I think that's where we are. It is an odd summary because we're not at the end of the journey, we're sort of in the middle. And I hope that some of you will work with us on that journey. And we will, I think the next 18 months is going to be a really interesting phase. And my hope, my personal hope, is that, I know somebody on the chat, I think it was Bernard, was saying, you know, that nothing's changed over a long time. I think there have been issues in the labour market. I've looked at the labour market for 40 years. I've never seen one as strange as this. I've never seen a labour market like this. And hopefully what we will see is a step change in our attitude to older workers as a consequence of the shock that we've seen with lockdown and the recovery. But I'm an optimist. I'm going to look at chat now. And I'm going to go back to the beginning. There's been a lot of questions about publishing the data, that the presentations and links to some of the studies that I've spoken about. I'm just wondering if anybody else can answer that for me. Can anybody on the panel answer that? And if you can you raise a hand? Johnny?
I'm pretty sure we'll publish a slide pack after the event and also put the recording online, but Neil can confirm that. But I think that's what we normally do.
Thank you. So that gets rid of quite a lot of the chat. The questions all in one go. There's a question about intersectionality, and I think that comes up repeatedly. About, you know, did we get underage to look at the other characteristics? George, do you want to have a conversation about that, or Beth?
Yeah, I can come in. We really wanted to be able to look at sort of intersectionality, but we were just limited by sample size, really. And the more you're sort of cutting your sample, looking at different groups, the less you can actually have the power to say anything about it. So we weren't able to look at other characteristics apart from age, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's sort of similar to our experience, and obviously we were coming at it from the sort of employer side rather than speaking to actual to older workers as candidates, and I think we were really restricted by actually what employers were paying attention to, and because we found that there was such a lack of attention paid to age, the focus was so much on race and ethnicity and gender. I mean, of course, I'm sure intersectionality plays a part, but yeah, it just wasn't something that we could explore because they just weren't thinking about age in that way.
For the research on with older workers themselves, I mean, in the I think we had a couple of findings in the survey, but mostly that's the same story, that when you start cutting it down in that many different subgroups, it's difficult to find anything that's statistically significant. But in the interviews, we spoke to older women, older, ethnic minorities and so on. And it's kind of the same story as with the age discrimination, that they find it very hard to interpret whether there's intersectionality or whether the kind of like bias and disadvantage is just related to one over the other. It was quite the normal story was that people would see their other protected characteristics to kind of like be more dominant than any disadvantage they would get from age. So for instance, if they felt they were discriminated against because of their religion or ethnicity, that was kind of like the overriding concern they had, and they hadn't necessarily thought about whether that might interact with age.
Thank you. I'm really glad actually that one of the things this forum has done is actually created a lot of networking. So there's lots of links with each other on this. I'm looking for specific questions. Gosh, Bernard, you are very cynical, aren't you? I think we've got to be a bit more hopeful. Yeah. I'm not seeing any more questions, specific questions in this group, but I'm just interested in terms of the panel and you're hearing each other's presentations. What do you feel in terms of your learning, what you've learned working with this project, and what do you think about where we are now with furlough and recruitment? I'll go to Beth first in terms of the Institute. Sorry, I'm picking you up here.
I think, yeah, I mean, obviously our research was really focused on the current landscape and what was going to be happening in the future. And I think, yeah, there's definitely some learning in there in terms of how people should adapt their recruitment practices, thinking about older workers and coming out of furlough. And I guess it wasn't really covered in my presentation, but in the report, we talk a bit more about specific industries and some of the differences there. And obviously furloughs had like different impacts on different industries. So for example, hospitality, where furlough was obviously really high, and that was one of the industries where some of the practices were particularly discriminatory, I think, against older workers. So yeah, I think there's definitely some good learning from our research that can be applied, yeah.
Thank you.
Happy to jump in as well. I think the main surprising thing from our work was that, I know ours was kind of quite a specific experimental study, but that is not, that age stereotype language maybe doesn't have the impact that we expected, but generally we found that job adverts rarely use positive older age language. They rarely have language like dependable or reliable, those kinds of things, but they're much more likely to have enthusiastic, fun, those kind of younger age stereotypes. So there probably is a lot of scope to boost those a little bit, to signal interest in a wider sort of range of people. But I think mainly just the finding that so rarely do job adverts include benefits such as flexible working and pension contributions and things like that, given that they are so valued by job seekers. It's such a missed opportunity not to encourage more people to apply. And I think flexible work in particular will be a real game changer if more employers offered that to increase how many people they get and the talent.
Thank you. And Johnny?
Yeah, I think I mean, in terms of furlough and the pandemic and so on, I mean, obviously it came up a lot. One of the things that came up from older workers themselves was that the pandemic has really changed and sometimes exacerbated stereotypes about older people, for instance, in terms of vulnerability, in terms of kind of like health and stereotypes about long-term sickness and so on, and older workers that we interviewed really worried about how that would develop in the future and whether that would kind of disadvantage them even further. And they also, you know, with the talk about all those stereotypes, there was a tendency, and they recognize that sometimes, of internalizing these stereotypes even more than they would usually do. There were also some like kind of surprising considerations about how it could potentially affect them positively. So one of the things was that people were like wondering whether working from home, and if that kind of took hold. Obviously it's a while ago now that we did the interviews, but whether that would reduce the potential negative impact on this kind of like team fit or cultural fit that Beth spoke about, if we were all like working from home or working from home 3 days a week or whatever, then maybe that would be less of a focus in assessments of them, and that might remove some disadvantage for them in interviews and recruitment. I think there were also kind of like a lot of considerations about, you know, going online in interviews, for instance, how that would affect them. I think there was some participants who spoke about, you know, you are kind of less on show, and this kind of thing that I spoke about in terms of like going through the office and seeing a young office and kind of being very, you know, definitely older than the selection panel and stuff, that might be less of a concern when you're just being interviewed online. So yeah, there are loads of kind of like considerations like that. Obviously at the time there were not so much talk about shortages and whether older workers could that could be an opportunity for them to fill out shortages and so on. So I expect that would have been quite different if we've spoken to them now.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm advised, I can't see on my screen, that we have some people that have raised hands, and Neil is managing this organisation. So I think it would be good if we can put the people with raised hands to ask their questions directly. Can we do that, Neil?
We can. I'll if I invite Tim Lernig in first of all.
Thank you. I was just a bit bored of typing things in the chat, so I thought I would appear live, or at least you can hear me. There's been a lot of talk about how employers prefer young people, or dare I say it, middle-aged people, to older workers, and I'm now 50. I've had my first free flu jab. It was very exciting. I'm living my best life. We know this is also true of people with disabilities. We know that it takes a very full tide for people with disabilities to get employed. We also know that employment rates are much higher in the Southeast in general, but they're disproportionately higher for people with disabilities. So I want to know, is there regional data on employment rates for older workers? Because if people are right in arguing that employers only employ older workers when they can't find younger workers, then we should find that older workers are disproportionately employed in the Southeast than in, say, the Northeast or Northern Ireland, in line with the disability numbers. And as such, the claim, employers don't want older workers unless they have to take them, is a testable proposition. But if we find employment rates are the same across the country, then I'm not seeing that sort of discrimination in the same way. What I'm seeing there is that actually there are some jobs that are less well suited to older workers. I was at a working dinner yesterday in the hospitality sector, and they were talking about standing up for 12 hours on a shift. I could have done that at one point in my 20s. I know in truth I just couldn't do it now. It's not discrimination if someone doesn't want to employ me. It's an accurate summary of the fact that people in their 50s have more musculoskeletal issues than younger people on average. So I'd be really interested in the regional data in order to understand, is it discrimination?
You're on mute, Kim.
Sorry, slightly off topic, but actually really important. I mean, my understanding of data around the older group is that it's one of the things that we need to dig into. We don't always have data at the lower level for this age group, but I think there is regional data actually. And what drives me to believe there's regional data is the IFS study that actually makes comment on the fact that geographically older workers are doing worse in certain geographies, and in particular they make a point around London. Does anybody on the panel know the answer to that, or are we going to have to take it? I'm seeing shaking heads. It's slightly off topic here. I think one of the lessons I've learned from this is that I think there are some people here that had a slightly different expectation of the conversation we're going to have. No, I don't think we can take that one at this session, but we'll come back to it.
Can I make another comment to what Tim said?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just kind of picking up on a couple of the points you raised. It is right that the older workers we spoke to, you know, quite often said, yes, the stereotype is true, and you know, with your example, like I wouldn't be physically able to do this task, but I think the kind of like frustration was that to be stereotyped and just the kind of like assumption that all older workers would be according to the stereotype. So we spoke to I think it was a woman in her 50s or even 60s who were stereotyped according to that, physically less capable, and she was like doing like, I think it was marathons or Ironmans or whatever at the same time. So it was this like kind of across the board. Then I should also mention, because you mentioned like different age groups, that we found something quite interesting in the survey, that there was actually quite a few people in their 20s and 30s and so on who said they felt stereotyped against because of their older age. So there's some quite interesting things that could be explored in the future. You know, whether you feel like once you're getting into your late 20s, early 30s, whether you are not seen as fit for a kind of entry kind of role. So there's age discrimination on all levels. So obviously in this project we're focused on the 50 plus.
Yeah, I'm always quite surprised by the number of people that are still working in their 70s. We did a little quiz at work the other day, and it's something like 8 or 9% of 70 pluses are still in work. There is a huge differential, and unfortunately, quite often that differential is determined by socioeconomic group, and poorer people tend to be in less well health. So it's very tricky. Have we got any more hands up, Neil?
There is. I'll come to Kathy next. There's 2 more after that.
Brilliant, thank you.
Kathy, we should be able to hear you now.
Hi, it's Kathy. Sorry, I put my hand up by mistake. So I'm listening with interest because I'm actually a MSc student looking to do my dissertation on older workers and older female workers. So I'll pick up all your details from the chat, but it's been a really interesting seminar. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go to Bernard next. Should be able to hear you now, Bernard. Can you hear us, Bernard?
You're not.
Okay. I'll move to Philip, and I'll come back to Bernard.
Yeah, thank you. I run a social enterprise called Goals UK, and I've been working for over 30 years with primarily long-term unemployed people, and a large number of those have been 50 plus. And the focus of our work is really on helping older people to change their attitudes and their mindset. And you know, the whole fulfilling, the whole idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, if you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're probably right. And so I think it's really important that there's more work done around helping older people to maintain a positive outlook and look for a good fit between their past wisdom, and I call it wisdom because I think older people 50 plus have got a lot to offer, but they've got to be flexible, they've got to be adaptable, and they've got to believe that it is possible. And the majority of people find work through networking rather than through advertising. And so they've got to, as much as possible, maximize that network. But I do think that the agencies that are helping long-term unemployed people have got to do more in terms of helping people to be more positive and to believe that that they can be of service. And that might be volunteering to start with, or offering to an employer to bring me in for a month and I'll work for you to demonstrate how valuable I can be to your business. You know, what employers looking for? They're looking for attitude more than skills. But I think more needs to happen in terms of promoting the importance of mindset. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have an observation in that? The panel, George, you've taken your mic up. Oh,
yeah, maybe Johnny, feel free. Well, I'll quickly. Yeah, no, I completely agree, and it's just interesting that idea of mindset because we're very much the behavioural insights team. We care very much about behaviour, and I think sort of what you were saying about how best to change someone's mindset is to give them the kind of experiential opportunity or the behaviour so that they can get that positive feedback. So more placement opportunities or work experience, as you say, sort of you only believe it when you actually are there living and breathing it, I suppose. So yeah, I would agree that more lived experience would definitely help change mindsets.
Yeah, I completely agree as well that what we say in our report is it almost becomes like a vicious cycle where, you know, it's very evident that older workers are discriminated against and disadvantaged, but then those experiences of that leads them almost to, you know, to this self-fulfilling prophecy that you speak of, Philip, that, you know, they start actually discriminating against themselves and directly, really, by, you know, avoiding certain jobs, avoiding applying for certain jobs because they just assume that they will not get selected. They start kind of underselling themselves. It also impacts their confidence. So some people spoke about doing worse in interviews because they're very conscious of the fact that they're discriminated against. So yeah, it's definitely one of kind of the highlights is that it's both on the employer side, and on the employee side. But the problem is, it feels like it's starting on the employer side. So I think that's why I think that's a good place to start, but that doesn't mean you can't do both.
I think what is really interesting in some of the work we've done over the summer is who employers look to influence them on this agenda. And what was really interesting was actually they themselves recognise that they are responsible for the agenda and that they should do more, these ones that are not planning to do anything for 2 years. But they also looked to government as well. So there were the two areas that they looked to. And when we dug underneath that, what was very interesting was that actually they like ambassadors and leaders. And so I think one of the things that we need to look for in this next phase of work is the very best practice and to get some business leaders into this agenda that are going to represent it and to speak the truth, if you like, to employers as a whole. And again, that's why I really welcome the next phase of this partnership with CIPD and REC. We need to find those organisations that have got the really great stories to tell. I saw B&Q come up on the chat, and that's a long and well-established best practice. Northwest Electric are quite an interesting organisation as well, and they are, you know, deliberately going to the market for a multi-generational workforce. So I think that's something that we need to press ahead with in the coming months and to set that best practice out to frame the conversations that everybody's having. Have we got anybody else with their hand up?
We have. I will attempt if Bernard, I know Bernard, you said you weren't on mute, but we couldn't hear you. Can you hear us? Can we?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, right. This is because right. Okay. Thing one, I have been doing this for more decades than I like to care about. My very first job after graduate school was working on age and employment in Germany when there was a perceived older worker unemployment problem, although most of the rest of Europe was talking about young people and unemployment. This is after the first oil crisis. So I mean, I have seen this in various capacities, working in various institutions in different countries and in international organizations for ages. And I would like to come back to the point that somebody did actually raise, I think it was his hand on this, and said, it's all about demand, because ultimately, you know, sort of that is when we get high levels of employment for older workers and we get lower levels at other times. And there is an extent to which older workers are part of a flexible labour force. And I've seen this over so many employment crises since 74, 75, right up to at least the global financial crisis, or whatever that one was called, when I was even writing about it then. But in Japan, in Germany, you name it, I've been there, I've seen it. The other thing, and what, as I said, I did hope that we were going to be talking about the post-furlough and what was going to happen to older people post-furlough. Were they going to be treated differently? And this is the reason why I asked, do we actually have any information that is a little bit more than one or two statistics which say they are more or less likely to be furloughed and or more or less likely to return post-furlough. And a lot of the problem there is that actually we don't have very much data on furloughed workers. The LFS picks up absence from work, but it doesn't pick up furlough per se. So there are all kinds of absences in the LFS. HMRC picks up merely the numbers of people, but it doesn't say very much more about it. So we actually don't know very much, and we should accept that we don't know very much. But there are other things which we do know. And I mean, when I wrote a little while, a few minutes ago, that I felt even more cynical about this, there is a hell of a lot of work that has been done about issues like training. Do older workers want to be retrained? And if so, how? Are employers willing to retrain older workers? And if so, how are they going to do this? Are the attitudes about this correct or incorrect? I mean, are they well-based at least or not well-based? There's a lot of discussion about this, none of which has been talked about, yet people throw up their hands every time and say, oh, well, all we need is some more training. The government, I listened to a government minister this morning on the 9 o'clock news saying, of course, there are lots of programs for people post-furlough, and it listed off a number of specific measures. Actually, a lot of those are directed towards younger people rather than older people, but that wasn't mentioned either. The other thing which I think you ought to think about is, are there age specificities in terms of competence? Well, one of the things which has been very well established over years and years and years is that within age differences on matters like competence, within age differences are at least as great as across age differences. Now, whether people understand that...
Bernard, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut in there because
okay. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years and actually I don't give a damn because I had enough. I really don't.
Bernard, thank you. I'm really, thank you for your observations. I'm cutting in simply because we've got other people with their hand up, and I appreciate your observations. And I think it might be worthwhile us talking offline about some of those things. But I'd like to.
That's actually why I've retired. I've given up because, you know, there's so much you can say, and at a certain point, you know, sort of you give up talking to brick walls. I've asked people if they're interested, they can contact me by asking Nisa how to get hold of me. And if people do want to, but I'm not going to join things like LinkedIn, not at my age.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. Thank you for your contact details. I'm going to ask Neil if we've got one more person with their hand up, and we've only got 7 minutes. Can I catch you after the meeting from your contact details, and we'll take that conversation offline because I'd like to stick with the Grow project if we can. Neil, can you go to the next one, please?
Janice, we should be able to. You should be able to talk now.
Hello. I think one of the points that needs to be made is that when we're talking about age, we're talking about a whole spectrum of people. age itself is not a characteristic. It is just a category of people who are all as different as everybody else. But the other thing, talking about the mindset of older people, is that there's been research to show that because of the negative portrayals of age and the aging process, this starts to impact on people's sort of mentality and their psyche from as early as the age of 6. People begin to grow up with this idea that age is something bad and that the aging process is something to be avoided. And that is what, it's not so bad when you're younger, because that's just something that's being fed into you. But once you actually reach that age, that's the time when all that lifetime of being bombarded with these images begin to be internalized. And there is actually research to show that it has a measurable impact on life expectancy. I think it's about 7 years from one extreme to the other, you know, depending on how resilient you are to being able to withstand these negative images and retain confidence in your own ability. So that was really all I had to say, and that was in the context of, you know, kind of mental, what's the word? Just in personal view of oneself. So that was all I had to say.
Thank you, Jo. That's actually it's a really good observation. And in other work that we have looked at, and indeed in this work, what we have found is that organisations can have brilliant policies and processes, but if you don't address the people as well and the culture and the ageism, it's not going to make a change. And I mean, indeed, in other work that I've been involved in, there's been observations that organisations with good policies and cultures still use ageist language when they talk about their great policies and cultures. It's quite a huge challenge.
It's not only in the workplace, it's across the whole of society and the media.
We recently put out some material re-imaging age, actually, which are resources that are available to anybody, and that is something that we're going to try and keep on doing, is providing resources that reposition that whole thing. And there is an absence of positive images. And I personally feel that often when we talk about older workers, we talk about the 1 in 4 that has a health issue, not the 3 that don't. And in my 60s myself, I find that more acutely than ever. And I do think what is helpful is that if we go to the pre-pandemic, we were seeing significant progress, actually. We were seeing more older workers in the labour market than ever before. And the drivers for that were sometimes blunt instruments like the extension of the pension age, but actually women coming through that benefited from maternity leave and have lifetime careers. And as we see those people progressing through the labour market, I think it does its own part to reposition the older worker in the labour market. And for myself, I mean, the big change for me personally in the labour market was maternity leave. And I do remember, you know, I was of the age when maternity leave came in, the huge resistance employers had to, you know, giving people time off to have children and guaranteeing them a job when they returned. It was absolutely massive, and yet it's accepted practice now. And so I do feel that we will see change, but I don't think we will see change in a snapshot. It will be a gradual progression. And from that point of view, I'm going to give the panel members one last opportunity to say something before we close. I'm going to start with Johnny, and then Georgie, and then Beth.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks so much everyone for taking part in the event, and it's a very interesting chat. I think just to say in terms of we will like send out the slides and the recording and stuff, which a lot of people ask for. I'm not like completely sure how. Obviously we have all your email addresses, but there's like GDPR and we can't like share them. So I've put our like events email address for NISA in the chat, so you can get in touch there, and then we'll figure out how to kind of like put people in touch with each other. So yeah, I know that was very practical last bit, but yeah. Georgie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, not much to say from me apart from thank you so much for your engagement. It's been great. And yeah, to the points on stereotype threat, I think that's really valid. It makes a huge difference to people's mentality. And I posted a link to some work that we've done on that to try and reduce minorities' sense of stereotype threat when they're going through recruitment processes, which can make them perform worse than they otherwise would. But anyway, thank you very much. I'll pass to Beth.
Yeah, just echo what the others have said. Just thank you everyone for coming and for participating. It's been really great just reading the chat as we've gone along. And yeah, I guess as a final reflection, I was just thinking about the kind of the pre-pandemic progress that Kim was talking about, and kind of looking forward at post-pandemic, and some of the future changes that we found in our research to do with sort of looking more at competencies. And I think that ties in with the kind of mindset conversation that we were talking about, and also the flexibilities that hopefully we'll see in the future that could be a positive for this agenda for change. So yeah, thank you everyone. It's been really interesting.
Thank you so much. We had over 100 people on that call, and I don't think I've ever seen such a lively chat. Have a great day, everyone. And I'm sure that you'll see lots of stuff in the news today around furlough. It's a really interesting day, full stop. And I hope we speak again soon.